Can you ask for forgiveness when you've done nothing wrong? Deep in the soul there are pains without names, not born from actions, but from absences, from the invisible fractures caused by being too much or too different or simply unfiltered. You didn't harm anyone. You didn't betray any promise, but still, something in you carried weight, as if living in your own way was a quiet form of rebellion. You weren't guilty, yet you lived as though you owed the world an apology. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a response to guilt. It's a gesture toward the child you once were, the one who learned early that being different was dangerous. That feeling too much made people uncomfortable. That dreaming too loudly was a threat. That child tried to adapt to be quiet, to deserve love by erasing edges. And somewhere along the way you began to feel shame, not for something you did, but for who you were when no one was watching. There's a silent cell where many souls dwell, not made of bars but of expectations and tight smiles. And you stepped inside it slowly, thinking you were being good, being safe, being smart. But safety became erasure. Caution became exile, until the body began to protest, not with words but with fatigue, anxiety, the slow fading of joy. Forgiveness came not as relief, but as release. You forgave yourself for thinking you needed forgiveness. And with that, the walls dissolved. Not broken, just no longer believed. Have you felt it too? That strange, wordless guilt, not from any wrong you did, but from not fitting the shape expected of you? There is a subtle, ancient sorrow in those who never did anything wrong, yet feel the need to apologize for existing as they are. It is not born from action, but from presence. From walking into a room and feeling like you've taken up too much space simply by breathing. It's the guilt of being whole in a world that teaches you to fracture yourself. The guilt of honesty, of depth, of not playing small enough. You didn't choose this burden. You inherited it. From voices that flinched at your intensity. From rooms where silence meant survival. From families that taught love with conditions and tenderness with fear. You began to adjust, soften, blur the edges. You bent not out of deceit but out of longing, for safety, for belonging, for peace. But in bending, you became someone else's version of yourself. This is the cruelty of invisible guilt. It's not about what you did, but what you are. You carry it not in shame, but in politeness. You apologize before speaking. You smile so as not to disturb. You shrink without being asked. And no one notices the violence because it looks so much like virtue. But beneath the courtesy lies exhaustion, a constant self-checking, a quiet betrayal repeated daily. And somewhere inside, the unaltered self waits, not bitter, not angry, just still, watching, remembering, longing to be allowed without having to ask. Have you ever felt guilty not for your mistakes but for your essence? There was no crime. Still, I stood trial every day, not in a public court, but in a private chamber of my own making. I assembled it slowly, unknowingly, brick by brick, out of old shames, misread glances, inherited fears. I was the defendant, the judge, the jury. There was no indictment, yet the sentence was always the same. Reduce yourself. Speak softly, apologize without cause. Carry the guilt of a life that simply chose to feel. No one ever pointed a finger at me. The accusations were ambient, felt in the air, never voiced. They hovered in the silence after I spoke too honestly. They flickered in the eyes of those who found my presence too intense, my gaze too steady, my sadness too inconvenient. So I learned to trim myself, to package my truth in digestible fragments, to smile when I wanted to weep, to agree so I wouldn't feel alone. And in that long, quiet surrender, I became a stranger to myself. Not because I changed, but because I disappeared. Years passed and the courtroom stayed. I carried it inside like a cathedral of shame, a sacred architecture of self-denial. And yet one day, without drama or defiance, something cracked. Not out of strength, but from weariness. I looked around and realized This trial never had a case. This guilt was never mine. I had memorized the rules of someone else's pain, lived under laws I never consented to. And in that clarity, I stood up. I didn't protest. I didn't scream. I simply walked out. The judge said nothing because there was no judge, only a mirror. And I finally stopped asking it for permission to be whole. It wasn't a special day. No ceremony, no revelation. Just a quiet morning, the kind that usually passes unnoticed. Except this time, the light came in at an angle that revealed the dust. There was a mirror I had stopped looking into long ago. Not a literal one. This was internal, a reflection clouded by expectations, by years of being told I was too much or not enough. Every time I tried to see myself, all I found was the residue of someone else's discomfort. So I stopped looking. I stopped trying to know who I was beneath the fog. But that morning I didn't turn away. I reached for the cloth, not out of hope but fatigue, tired of being an edited version of a self I never chose. With slow, uncertain hands I began to wipe. And layer by layer the stories fell. The shame, the guilt, the faces I wore to keep the peace. Beneath them all was something simple, still and strangely unfamiliar. A face that had never done harm. A presence that had never deserved exile. For the first time I saw myself without accusation. The eyes didn't flinch, the mouth didn't apologize. The posture didn't shrink, and I realized I had never needed forgiveness. I had needed clarity. I had needed to see that my existence wasn't a disruption, but a fact. A truth that required no justification. That day, the mirror did not reflect a perfect person. It reflected a real one. And that was enough. I didn't bless myself. I didn't whisper absolution. I simply stood there, breathing. And in that quiet, dense breath, the burden lifted. Not because I was forgiven, but because I was finally seen. There was no moment of triumph. No epiphany wrapped in light. Only a door, weathered, wooden, long mistaken for a wall. I had walked past it countless times, certain it was sealed, certain I hadn't earned the right to cross it. Because even without doing anything wrong, I believed I still needed to atone. For being different, for being unedited, for taking up space. But one evening, not out of courage but quiet exhaustion, I placed my hand on the wood, and it moved, effortlessly, without resistance, without sound. It had never been locked, only misread. On the other side, there was no answer, no divine verdict, only open air, a field of stillness, not asking to be understood, no mirrors, no critics, no echo of apology. Just the gentle sound of my own steps, unafraid for the first time. There, I didn't have to perform softness. I didn't have to translate my joy. I didn't have to whisper when I wanted to weep. I existed, not as a version, not as a compromise, but as presence. I didn't forgive myself for a mistake. I forgave myself for believing there had ever been one, for thinking I had to earn the right to be whole. That simple shift, invisible to the world, monumental within, was the beginning of a quiet kind of freedom. I didn't arrive. I returned. To the self that had been waiting behind the closed door, not locked out, but forgotten. And in that return, I found a kind of home no one else could give me. The dignity of belonging to myself. Without permission, without guilt, without apology. Mantra phrase for comments. I forgave myself for believing there was something wrong with me. Not all forgiveness needs to be spoken. Some is embodied, lived in the silence that follows when you no longer shrink. This video is not a conclusion. It's a pause, a place you can return to when the shame creeps back in disguised as self-discipline. You don't have to comment. You don't have to share. But if something in you softened, if something recognized itself, leave this phrase as your offering. I forgave myself for believing there was something wrong with me, not as confession, as anchor, not for others, for the part of you that waited quietly, for years, to be welcomed without revision. If this silence touched someone else's silence in your heart, send it. Subscribe if a part of you still longs to be. without permission, without apology. Some freedoms don't arrive with noise, they simply stop. The judgment, the self-erasure, the belief that you had to earn your own existence. Leave without explaining. Return when forgotten. Here, you are not wrong. You simply are.